To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. To die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life.
Undermine the authority right to make capitalism work with good and humane labor government, and we haven't succeeded because it can't work.
Their views might be, and this will continue to be the case for as long as I am Speaker. Mr. Benn.
Anthony Wedgwood Benn, as he was known in the 60s, had renounced his birthright. He served as Technology Minister in Harold Wilson's first government and Industry Secretary in the 70s.
The whole deterrent argument is a fraud.
Branded a rebel from within, vilified by Labour and Tory opponents for his left-wing views, yet admired by all shades of opinion for his intellect.
Basically, he's a dreamer. When he's got a dream about a Britain in which the workers will have control.
It's about whether our society puts people in a place of dignity and serves them, or whether you just hand over your money to gamblers who don't create any wealth at all.
His problem is that he's about 10 years in front of his time.
I think he is a kind of aging perennial youth. He immatures with age.
Age is something put upon you by events, but it isn't something that you feel normally. I don't think of myself as being very old, because you still look at the world through the same eyes. Everyone has a time to live and a time to die. It's the pressure of what you should do that keeps me going, really. I have come to terms with death. My wife said she regarded death as a great adventure. She wasn't at all frightened of death. And she taught me how to live, and she taught me how to die, and you can't ask more of anyone than that. Well, I met Caroline in 1948 at Worcester College. She'd come to the end of her summer term as a course at Oxford, and I met her on the 2nd of August.
And 9 days later, I proposed to her because I realized that she was going home and I'd never see her again if I didn't propose. I proposed on a bench in Oxford outside a church, and later I bought the bench from the church for £10, and it's now been put in front of her grave, and her spirit inspires the whole of this place and all my family. We're a very close family, and much of our life has come through this house, and they feel it as I do. My father once said to me, every life is like a pebble dropped into a pool, and the ripples go backwards and forwards forever, even if you don't see them again, and that is true. If you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you are, and you don't know where you're going, looking back at what's happened and thinking about it and trying to draw lessons from it is very interesting. I was brought up in the non-conformist radical tradition. My dad was a socialist, and his grandfather had been a congregational minister, and he was a Congregationalist in his thinking. And so the two married together very well, the political and the personal. I had two brothers, Michael, who was nearly 4 years older than me, and David, who was nearly 4 years younger. My mother was a very dedicated Christian and campaigned for the ordination of women. And I think she implanted in my mind the idea that all real questions were moral questions. Is it right or is it wrong? You could argue about that, but that was really the key question to ask. And when I was a child, the thing that always made me cry was if something I thought was unfair was done. And that registered with me very much indeed. My mother once said to me, the Bible is the story of the conflict between the kings who had power and the prophets who preached righteousness. And she taught me to support the prophets against the kings, and it's got me into a lot of trouble in my life, but the older I get, the more important I think that is. Throughout the 1930s, the fear of war and of the destruction war would bring was a dominant consideration I had in my mind. My parents went to Munich in the 30s, came back and reported about Hitler and about the anti-Semitism and so on. The development of anti-Semitism was very calculated. There was mass unemployment. It was due to defeat in the First World War and all sorts of other things. But Hitler said no, he said it's all due to the Jews. So he built up support. He said, give me power and I'll give you full employment. And he did. Finding a false enemy to build strength for yourself politically was what the anti-Semitism was all about. Weak governments like war because it very often makes them look strong and tough. And that is one of the things we have to watch very, very carefully. Who wants war? The arms manufacturers, weak political leaders, newspaper editors are looking for a better circulation. And
Helping people to understand the ingredients of war is one of the ways in which you can make war less likely. To be in a country at war when the country is fighting for its survival is very frightening. When I look back on it now, I have the sense that the whole world is coming to an end. When the war came, I joined the Air Force as soon as I was old enough. And in the years of the war, I had my real education because I'd been privately educated, and you don't meet anyone but a very narrow section of society. And in the Air Force, I met everybody. That really shaped my thinking very, very substantially. I spent a year in Zimbabwe during the war learning to fly. It was then called Southern Rhodesia. It was a society which had none of the basic rights that we had been taught were human rights. And at that time, the Africans had no vote at all. It was all entirely controlled by the white population. And that really interested me in the liberation movement. And when I got into Parliament, I got very deeply involved in the movement for colonial freedom and working with the South Africans against apartheid and so on. It made some progress, but at the same time, the gap between the standard of living in Africa and here is very great. So colonial liberation was only one stage in the process. While I was in Africa, we had classes every day on various aspects of flying. And at the very beginning of the class, somebody came in and brought the letters from home. And there was a telegram from my mother. It said, "Precious Michael gave his life today, family more united than ever." I had to sit throughout the whole of that class with nothing else in my mind but that message. And then I went out into the airfield and burst into tears. The shock was horrific and the sense of loss horrific. It was a terrible tragedy for me because I was devoted to my brother. He was a wonderful guy. I missed him terribly and he inspired me in so many ways. I was in the services, and I remember hearing on the news that the Americans had used this extremely powerful weapon. I went to Hiroshima once, and I was shown round by a Japanese man, and he took me along the road, and on the pavement there was a little dark mark. And I said, "Why are you showing me that?" And he said, "Well, that's where a child was sitting when the bomb landed. And the child was vaporized, and all that was left of that child was a little mark on the pavement." At the end of the war, when I came back to college, one of the pilots who'd been at Hiroshima came and talked to us, and he said, all the work you're doing now is a complete waste of time unless you tackle this question of nuclear weapons. And that made me know what I wanted to do. I wanted to go into Parliament.
Anthony Wedgwood Benn, Bristol South East Divisional Labour Party. Now, I only ask this. I am not a pacifist. I never have been a pacifist. But I'm quite convinced as a practical matter that it would never be right or practical ever to use the hydrogen bomb.
Atomic energy has been liberated. And that fact makes war merely a form of suicide for mankind.
Nuclear weapons are so dangerous that you have to keep quiet about them. And at the end of the war, Attlee continued building nuclear weapons, and he never told Parliament or the Cabinet what he'd done. And so, in a way, the very existence of nuclear weapons destroys democratic accountability. I was a shadow spokesman for the Labour opposition in Parliament on defence, and I resigned in 1958 because I couldn't contemplate circumstances under which we could ever use the nuclear weapons.
I had never any sympathy, as people who know anything about me must know, with the Soviet system and its lack of democracy. But I never believed that the Russians were threatening to invade Western Europe. I never believed it. I don't think most people in this country were going to take, with all their domestic problems, going to take over West Germany, Italy, France, come to London, deal with Ken Livingstone, go to Northern Ireland and deal with Ian Paisley. And yet that threat was the most convenient political instrument ever used in domestic politics, because if you ever criticised the Conservative government, then you were an agent of the KGB. Now, you see, the second thing is, we can't afford nuclear weapons either. In my opinion, when we look back at all the arguments about why the British economy is weak since the last 40 years, one of the major reasons is we've wasted too much money on weapons of war that were not necessary.
With all the cuts made in public expenditure in recent years, the one obvious cut would have been to cut out 70 billion quid, which is what we're spending on a new generation of nuclear weapons. I regard that as a big moral issue, an absolutely central question on which people have to say what they think. And that's why when I first heard the words of the United Nations Charter in the summer of '45, those words made such an impression on me. I remember them to this day.
Of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime have brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person.
Those words registered with me because here was a statement being made on behalf of the human race. And I still believe that the UN's got a huge role to play in order to avoid conflict and resolve the world's problems. In the post-war world, you were thinking, how can we do things that will make it good for us in comparison to the circumstances in which we live? And I think that brought the nation together.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen, they deserve the best that we can give them. And now, while we are making plans to make a land fit for those who won the war to come back to, we are looking ahead to see whether we can't ease the burden of taxation I am going to relieve 2 million people from income tax altogether next year. And just by way of balance, to put a little bit more on the big incomes, which can well afford to pay. Incomes of the big people whose wealth would have been lost if the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen had not risked their lives to defend it.
When Winston Churchill was Prime Minister of the coalition government, the level of taxation on the very richest was 95%. And the reason for it was very simple. They needed the money to fight the war, but also they felt everybody ought to make a proper contribution. I remember going on a troop ship to South Africa in 1944. We decided to have a meeting on war aims. I was sent to see the colonel in charge of troops, and I saluted and said, "Sir, can we have a meeting on war aims?" And the colonel said, "No politics in it, Ben." And I said, "Oh, no, not at all." And we had the most wonderful political discussion. And one lad got up, he said, in the 1930s we had mass unemployment, but he said, we don't have mass unemployment in wartime. He said, if you can have full employment by killing Germans, why can't you have full employment by building hospitals, building schools, recruiting teachers, recruiting nurses? You've got to do in peacetime what you do in wartime, develop your policies to meet people's needs. And it was that argument that triggered the 1945 victory, brought us big social changes.
Labour will now have a majority over all parties in a House of 640.
The course of the next few years may well decide the future of civilization for decades or for centuries.
British industry had been broken by the war, and we wanted to build up a new railway system in public ownership, a new National Health Service, of course, which was the centre of the whole thing. We nationalised the steel industry, we nationalised the mining industry, and indeed developed common ownership in any way that could advance the nation's progress. At a time we were completely bankrupt. We'd spent every penny we had on the war. Clement Attlee took Britain through that and built the National Health Service and the welfare state and started a big housing programme. And it was a remarkable recovery that we had. You could see so many people living in appalling conditions, such a huge social problem. It had to be dealt with, and it was dealt with very boldly. Before there was a health service, there were a lot of people who had no health care at all. There were certain charitable organisations, but the full resources that medicine could offer were not at the disposal of the poor. And Labour's housing programme was regarded as the great achievement of the post-war Labour government. They built hundreds of thousands of flats and homes for people. They did, of course, create jobs, because in order to build all those buildings, thousands and thousands of workers were involved. When they went up, they were seen as a sign of the new future for everybody. And when you look at the National Health Service, the welfare state, the rebuilding of our industries, it was a formidable achievement. We talk about the House of Commons as the mother of parliaments, and of course in a sense it's true, but you mustn't confuse parliament with democracy, because the principle of a democracy is the sovereignty of the people. It's the people who are sovereign, and they lend their powers to members of parliament to use for 5 years. But of course until quite recently not everybody had the vote. Indeed, it was in 1948, only 2 years before I was elected, that we got the principle of one man, one woman, one vote. When I look back on democracy, it seems to me to be a very revolutionary idea, because before there was any democracy, all power was in the hands of rich and powerful people, and everybody else were just slaves. And then when democracy came in, people who didn't have money could use the vote to buy with their vote what they couldn't afford with their wallet. And it transferred power from the marketplace to the polling station. And that gave us the National Health Service, which was the most socialist thing we ever did. And the thing about it was that it was accountable to those whom it served. One of the biggest battles I fought, and it was personal but also political, was a battle I had to keep out of the House of Lords.
I'm sure you will agree with me that it is absurd for a member of Parliament to be obliged to give up his seat in the House of Commons, not because his constituents have deserted him, not because he has been turned out at an election, but because he has inherited a peerage which he doesn't want and which he desires to renounce.
Well, there was a lot of public sympathy for somebody who didn't want an honour. But of course the real issue was, could this bit of nonsense about a peerage prevent a constituency from picking who they wanted to represent them? They had a by-election in Bristol, and I decided to stand even though I was a disqualified candidate.
The undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency. Anthony Neil Wedgwood Benn.
I won with a bigger majority than I'd had when I was qualified. But when I arrived in the House of Commons, the Speaker wouldn't allow me to enter the chamber.
Mr. Benn, what do you think of this judgment? Well, I think the interesting thing about it is this. The judges had to do an assessment of what British parliamentary democracy means in 1961, and they came to three conclusions. First of all, that the House of Lords is more important than the House of Commons. Secondly, that the democratic rights of electors to choose their own member of parliament must never be allowed to challenge the hereditary privileges of peers. And thirdly, that if electors do attempt to challenge it, as they did in Bristol, then they are to be punished by having a defeated candidate put in their place.
I don't believe in a hereditary member of parliament. I mean, if I go to the dentist and he begins drilling my teeth and he says, I'm not a dentist myself, but my father was a very good dentist, I think I'd pick somebody else. I don't believe in hereditary appointments of any kind. The present House of Lords is an absolutely obsolete idea. You can't have people making laws in Parliament who haven't been elected. You can't get rid of a member of the House of Lords. You can't actually contribute to getting somebody in the Lords. It's all done by patronage. And if you don't like it, well, you just got to lump it. So I think the House of Lords should be abolished. In the end, legislation that allowed people to renounce went through, and I went along and renounced that afternoon. And then there was another by-election, and this time I was elected.
Where does it work? Where's the doing? Ladies and gentlemen, it isn't on. It isn't on. No. Anthony Neil Wedgwood Benn, 20,300. Edward Druitt Martell,
Defeated the Tory cabinet. You have defeated the House of Lords. You have defeated the courts. You have changed the constitution of this country by your own power. And that is a very great achievement. And I am very, very proud indeed to be sent back for the 6th time to represent you in the House of Commons. And they won't lock the door this time. Thank you very much indeed.
My constituents wouldn't give way. And that's the most important lesson I've ever learned in my life. If you want justice, go to the people, don't go to the guys at the top. And if you carry on, you can win. By the end of the 50s, the Labour Party was trying to look ahead beyond the years, what they call the wasted years they'd been under the Conservatives, where opportunities had been lost and the society had shifted to the right. And Labour offered in Wilson's manifesto the New Britain. It was an idea that we could start again and build on what was good in us. When we were back in power in '64, Wilson appointed me Postmaster General, and it was a huge job because every postman and every telephone operator were in my department.
This is a great communications center. It will be joined to the world satellite system and is part, therefore, of a global network.
I really, really enjoyed the post office, but Wilson came to me in the summer of '66 and said, would I take on the Ministry of Technology?
From London's Houses of Parliament, the ancient seat of government in Britain, look half a mile up the Thames, and you'll see the brand new offices of a brand new idea in government. This is Mintech, the Ministry of Technology.
The object of technology is to get more out of less. This is what it's all about.
He's been given the job of getting more out of computers, nuclear power, machine tools, hovercraft, electronics, aerospace, shipbuilding, automation, engineering.
I didn't start the Concorde, and looking back on it, I wouldn't have started it because it was this idea that speed was everything, whereas actually the future lay in mass transit. But by the time I took charge of it, there were 250,000 people working on it, so I tried to keep it going.
Mr. Wedgwood Benn, Minister of Technology, and Monsieur Jean Chamon, French Minister of Transport, were ready to cut the tapes and launch the greatest airliner ever built.
My interest in the Concorde was never in the metal. It was in the people who built it and designed it. They were brilliant people. My wife and I decided to take up a group of people who built aircraft in Bristol for years. Some of them had been building aircraft for 30 years and never flown before. And one of them, as we got on the plane, said he'd taken the last communion, and I said, well, that doesn't show much confidence in your product. In 1975, I was moved from the Department of Industry to the Department of Energy, and it was at a critical period because North Sea oil began coming ashore.
A day of congratulation to the firms and to the people who have brought this oil ashore from under the most terrifying and capricious waters in the world. It's an astonishing technical achievement.
This is the first bottle of North Sea oil that was brought ashore, and I was there to receive it. And, of course, it posed enormous problems for us because we'd had no experience of being an oil producer.
As more oil came ashore, so did a new source of revenue for the government. Britain not only became self-sufficient, but also a major exporter.
It became clear there was a lot of money coming in which we could use for industrial development. And I was very keen to develop a North Sea oil fund. By the time I left office, a quarter of the revenues from the North Sea oil belonged to the British people.
The prospect of being free from debilitating balance of payments crises also transformed the political scene. The next government could stay in power for 20 years, said Harold Wilson. Unfortunately for him, it wasn't to be Labour.
When Mrs. Thatcher came to power, she sold off the oil we had and used it to pay for redundancy pay for people she'd sacked.
Every penny of the oil revenue has either gone on the dole, or foreign investment, or tax cuts. And the whole of the so-called Thatcher economic miracle was funded by the oil, and at the end we're left with no industrial base to speak of. That was a political decision that ruined it. It wasn't going wrong for any inherent reason of its own, just the money was handed over to other purposes than the improvement of our economy.
All choices are choices between right and wrong. They're all moral choices, political and personal. And I think that is the core of my belief, based on my judgment at a particular moment, what is the right thing and what's the wrong thing to do. I've made a million mistakes in my life, and I'm not ashamed of mistakes because that's how you learn. I think that is what life offers you, an opportunity to consider what you've done and what you've said, and then examine conscientiously whether you were right in what you said or not, and if you were wrong, then you have to explain it to yourself. Clearly, if you have a conscience, you're reminded all the time of where you failed, and that is a continual rebuke. You have a sense of guilt about it. And I think anyone who could look back on his life and said he had nothing to be ashamed of would not be speaking the truth. Well, I've made a lot of mistakes. I've changed my view, for example, on nuclear power. I did once think that civil nuclear power was an example of using nuclear energy which was cheap and safe and peaceful. I heard the broadcast describing the Hiroshima attack, and then 10 years later, President Eisenhower talked about atoms for peace. He said you can use atomic power to generate electricity. And I thought, well, this is a sort of classic case of swords into plowshares. And I used to argue that civil nuclear power was safe, it was cheap, and it was peaceful.
It is with pride that I now open Calder Hall, Britain's first atomic power station.
I was responsible for the nuclear power program for many years in Britain, and I learned from my own experience that it isn't cheap because they still haven't found a way of storing nuclear waste. It isn't safe if you look at Chernobyl and Fukushima and all the rest of it. And it isn't peaceful because I discovered after I left office that while I was there, without telling me, all the plutonium from our nuclear power stations was sent to America for their weapons program. So every so-called civil power station was actually a bomb factory for the Pentagon. I was so horrified by that I came out very strongly against nuclear power, and I am against it now. It was a mistake that I made. I understand why I made it, but it was a mistake. I think to recognize that you've got things wrong is absolutely essential if you're going to make sense of the problems you face next time round.
This is the first time that I've dictated my diary on tape, but it will allow me to speak much more frankly than I could do if I was dictating to a secretary. It does, of course, contain secret information and must remain under lock and key.
I began doing a journal during the war, simply jottings of what was going on and what interested me. Then in 1966 I began dictating because I couldn't cope with it all, so I just sat down at night, went through the day and the notes I'd made and began doing an account of the day. They're a record of my life and what happened, what I thought and who I met and what I did and the conclusions I reached. I suppose in a way they might have been letters to a friend, but they do represent a complete record of my political life. When you compare my accounts of cabinets with the official accounts, the decisions are the same because they both obviously report, but the cabinet minutes are very boring. They don't say who said anything. Mine say who said it and what the feeling was and how the anger rose and so on. So it's a more human account, really. They've been useful to me in the sense that they've sorted out what I was thinking at the time, and therefore my opinions came out of the diaries. And so it is really just the account I give to the Almighty on the Day of Judgment.
Well, that's it. Oh, God, I'm tuckered. It's the end of Monday, the 22nd of March.
I suppose if I reflect on the way our society is organised, democracy ought to be a means by which we change the system to meet people's needs. And it's been subtly transformed into changing people to meet the needs of the system. And that is the great failure. Many people go into Parliament with left-wing ideas and then end up on the right. I went the other way. What really shifted me to the left was my experience as a minister, because I realised as a minister that governments were in effect controlled by people you didn't elect. Of course, if you want to get on in politics, you have an interest to please the people in power above you. But there are elements there where you're under pressure to do what you might not want to do because of the fact that if you didn't, you'd lose your job. And I found that slightly uneasy, but it wasn't dirty. And it wasn't corrupt, but it showed that power had shifted to someone above you rather than coming from people who had chosen you. I always saw the Labour Party as an instrument of change, and then I realised as a minister that the government of which I was a member was not involved in changing things, but trying to run the system better. And that is not what I thought it was about.
He remained popular until he began to adopt a more radical political position. He spoke at the Upper Clyde Shipbuilders' Work-In in 1972.
We have, as the main speaker, a man who needs no introduction in place, say, Tony Wedgwood Benn. Our task, if we want a responsible society, is to give responsibility to ordinary people and take away the privilege from a minority who have dominated this country for too many centuries. Good luck, comrades. Thank you for inviting me.
After his involvement at UCS, Tony Benn moved to the left, and his speeches became more controversial.
Now, the word socialism is spat out on the media as if it was a sort of disease. They get a picture of somebody, sometimes me, with his hands out and his eyes open. Socialism, they say, and the children are put to bed, and mother has another Ovaltine and settles down to her novel from the Boots Library, and people hope it'll all go away. But that's not how it's pronounced. It is socialism. It's about trying to construct a society around production for need and not just for profit.
you realised that if you were going to make a change, you had to make a big change. And that is what being on the left is about. It's about getting away from dealing with the status quo and trying to adjust it, to trying to think of a better sort of society where people's needs are met more easily and effectively. Wilson went in the spring of 1976, and I think he realised what was coming. The International Monetary Fund and big business around the world decided they didn't like a Labour government, so they forced us to make cuts. When the proposal for the cuts were made, Callaghan, who was Prime Minister, said, well, let's have proper discussion about it. I gave him full marks for that. So I put in a paper on the alternative economic strategy, which ran absolutely against what the Treasury wanted. It was a more direct socialist control of the economy, so that we would do what we thought was right and not have it imposed on us by the IMF, a completely unelected body. It was then argued about and rejected. And in the end, the cabinet capitulated to the pressure, made the cuts. And of course, when the cuts were made, in a couple of years' time, it became apparent to the people in those industries what had happened, and they took action to defend themselves.
It cost the Labour government its life. It contributed to the mass unemployment which we now have. It wasn't necessary because, of course, the oil revenue was just beginning to come. But it was the beginning of the domination of the world economy by world bankers, and the IMF is really its political voice.
It was those cuts that led to the winter discontent, that led to the election of Mrs. Thatcher, and all the price we paid for that.
There are 1 million people now who are long-term unemployed, that's to say over a year, and something must be done. We are building up a society so unstable and so unfair that it's simply not acceptable.
I sometimes wonder if I'll ever get a chance just to sit with my children in a holiday jam. I like seeing it in Concorde, and would you give a second thought? Would you ever give a damn? I doubt it. Stand up, Margaret. Everybody shout it. Stand up, Margaret.
I grew up in the 30s with an unemployed father. He didn't riot. He got on his bike and looked for work, and he kept looking till he found it.
White love, shop, World War. Stand down, please. Stand down, Margaret. Stand down, please. Stand down, Margaret.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
I say stand down, Margaret. Margaret, stand down, please stand down, Margaret.
I was elected to Chesterfield on the day the miners' strike began in 1984, and I'd always supported the miners. And Mrs. Thatcher decided to make war on the miners because they were very strong trade unions. She wanted to erode trade union power. So I came out in support of the miners.
You listen to me for a moment, because I feel you brought me here under false pretenses.
No, I'd like to...
Well, let me make my point. I've just come back from Derbyshire. I've been there every weekend. I've been round on the soup round with the women last week, and I've seen what's happened. The police are arresting people. When they get them in the cells, they're asking them who they voted for. Did they vote for Arthur Scargill? What newspaper do they read? They're arresting people who are trying even to picket peacefully. And I think the ITN coverage of the dispute has been a disgrace, because here are people defending their jobs. They're trying desperately to see that their communities are not killed.
Oh, I don't think that's the case,
Why don't you cover the crisis in the mining industry upon which you and I will depend for energy when the oil runs out? As I tell you candidly, why support the miners? They do very dangerous and difficult work. Our future depends upon them. Whole communities will die if they are allowed to be treated this way. The police are going well beyond the law.
We just report what we find.
I doubt that. I don't think that's what you're doing at all, truthfully, but that's your business.
Mr. Tony Benn.
It was class war. After nearly a year out, the miners were defeated and had to go back.
This band behind me will tell you that that trophy means more to me than out else in the whole world. But they'd be wrong. Truth is, I thought it mattered. I thought that music mattered. But does it bollocks? Not compared to how people matter. Us winning this trophy won't mean bugger all to most people, but us refusing it, like what we're going to do now, well, then it becomes news, doesn't it? You see what I mean? That way I'll not just be talking to myself, will I? Because over the last 10 years, this bloody government has systematically destroyed an entire industry. Our industry. And not just our industry. Our communities, our homes, our lives. All in the name of progress and for a few lousy bob.
The end of the strike is interesting. The Conservative Party threw out Mrs. Thatcher and the miners re-elected Arthur Scargill. That indicated where the real commitment was. Whether you win or lose a battle, in the long run doesn't matter. The question is, did you fight it hard? And we look back on so many occasions in the past where working people have been defeated. Can you draw inspiration from the courage of people who fought the battle that was their job to fight? Whether you win or lose isn't the final determinant of whether it was worth fighting. You have to fight or you lose. When people look back on her life now, the divisions and suffering which she caused and injustice which she perpetuated are much more remembered than the triumphs which she claimed.
We haven't come here to insult anybody. We have come here to tell you there's a different point of view than the one that the media has been pushing and ramming down my throats all the week. And if the family of Mrs. Thatcher feels insulted, let me tell them that our families are mortally insulted by the eulogizing of a woman who absolutely destroyed our communities and our ways of life.
Every year in the cathedral here in Durham, they have a service for the Durham miners. It's an occasion when they consecrate new banners, they invite preachers to come and speak. Some years ago, the Blackwall Colliery said they wanted to add me to their banner. And I can't imagine a greater honour than to be on a miner's banner. The gala is the big event of the year in Durham. It's a celebration of the history of Durham, of the mining industry itself, celebration of the fact that our whole industrial strength was built on coal, and it's also a celebration of our belief in solidarity. There are no pits left in the Durham area, but you can close a pit, but you can't close miners. As I've got older, I realised that Parliament can become a club. You're a member of a club. But actually, you are there to represent people. It's not just a cosy little place where you just meet and govern the country. It's a place where real issues are decided, and you have to put forward your arguments with passion and vote according to your conscience. And so I did vote quite a number of occasions against the Labour Party, including Labour governments. And I did so because I felt very strongly that was the right thing to do. Well, I'm a socialist, and if you support working people, you do get attacked. And they presented you as if you were a sort of, not quite a terrorist, but an enemy of society.
The Right Honourable Tony Benn was once described as a mad Marxist werewolf.
The main protagonists in the by-election had already taken up their positions. Tony Benn was trying to meet as many people as possible to prove he doesn't actually have horns.
They can call me a Marxist, a Jesuit, a flat earther, a Trotskyite, a vegetarian. I don't care, because I know why they call us names. It's because they dare not face our arguments. I was once the most dangerous man in Britain, and now I'm they're described as a national treasure. From being the most dangerous man in Britain to being a national treasure is also a danger, because if you're a national treasure, they're really saying you're a kindly, harmless old gentleman. And, well, I am kindly, I am old, I could be a gentleman, but I'm not harmless. You're not going to stop me.
But you've been on radio and you've done it already.
No, I'm sorry. The Disaster Emergency Committee Gaza Crisis is available at P.O. Box 999, London, EC3A 3AA. And I know from the BBC, because I've been here most of the morning, nobody here agrees with what the BBC have done.
You did hear the line from management there that it's a question of raising impartiality. The public will be concerned. And the other issue, of course, will the aid actually get to the people?
Well, if you saw children dying as they are today in Gaza, wouldn't you want to send it? People will die because of the BBC decision. Let me be clear about that. And I started my life 60 years ago as a BBC producer. I love the BBC. I support it. But it has capitulated to Israeli pressure. That's the truth, I have to tell you. I got a death threat the other day. I haven't had one for ages. I was so chuffed. It shows that I'm not seen by people still as harmless. When I was a young man, I was interesting to the media, and they reported what I said and so on. When I moved to the left and began making critical speeches about the system, then they begin to turn on you. And when the media turn on you, they're a very powerful assassination squad. I have seen the media at its most savage. The conventional view was that I had destroyed the Labour Party by what I was saying. And that wounded me because it wasn't true, but it was very, very damaging, as it meant that anything you did was written off immediately. And that was the period of the press persecution, which was horrible. They used to come into the garden at night, ring the front doorbell every 10 minutes throughout the night, is to shout at my children as they went to school, and they hoped my children would shout something back and they could film it. It was a very, very frightening experience, I found, having the media turn on you in the way they did. I think the family pay a very heavy price for having a parliamentary father, because I always had things that had to take priority. If I had a cabinet meeting the following morning, I had to prepare the night before, and that meant it took me away from my family and from my children. Caroline, my wife, was a very determined woman. She did have a very rough time as well. They printed untrue things about her. On the other hand, she was a very serious person. She understood exactly what was going on and was completely supportive of me. My dad said when I was young, always say what you mean and mean what you say. And that, as a principle, is very straightforward. If you have an opinion, you must express it, and then you take the flak that goes with it. And it's sometimes very severe criticism and destruction and misrepresentation, but if that's your view, you have to say it. And I think that was the only principle that could have possibly carried us through that period. We were defeated in 1979, and that was the last time I held ministerial office. So my experience from then on was never of politics from the inside at the top. It was from the outside at the bottom. The British press are very critical of the left. Everything the left does or argues for is always described as destructive. Matter of fact, when I look back on the history of the Labour Party, it's the right who've always got us into trouble.
Kinnock, Neil, 71.272%. I therefore declare Neil Kinnock elected as leader of the Labour Party.
Neil Kinnock came to power at a time when the Labour Party was on the defensive. We'd lost an election, and Neil became leader. And I think of Neil as the grandfather of New Labour. He thought the party would only succeed if it abandoned socialism and appeared as a centre party. Kinnock, who was a figure of the left, was very, very critical of the left, and always wanted to present himself in a different position from the one that I think he really held. He probably thought that the only way you'd win would be to move to the centre. And I'm not sure that's necessarily right. I think so long as people believe what you're saying, they will follow you, even if it does involve taking a bit of a risk. We've tried to make capitalism work with good and humane Labour governments, and we haven't succeeded because it can't work, because it rests on injustice, lives on inequalities, and if you try to modify them, then they turn on you and cut back your gains and throw you back to where you started. The argument always was if you move to the centre, you'll win, but if two centre parties competing for public support, neither of them can be real about changing things. Mrs. Thatcher did change things. She launched into a violent counterattack against democracy and the Labour movement. She did radicalise and create a new situation which New Labour inherited in 1997. But then New Labour was really based on the idea you accepted what Thatcher had done and just bumped along. And when Blair became leader, he said in 1994, New Labour is a new political party, which really was a Thatcherite party.
And I will devote every breath that I breathe, every sinew of my body, to ensuring that your grandchildren do get to live in that new Britain, in a new and better world. New Labour, New Britain.
I think the conclusion that lay at the heart of the foundation of New Labour was the idea you couldn't win if you didn't adopt Mrs. Thatcher's policies. And when Mrs. Thatcher was asked her greatest achievement, she said New Labour. The Labour Party was set up as a socialist party, and then when Blair became leader, he abandoned Clause 4 of our Constitution. Clause 4 did make us into a socialist party. It contained within it a basic socialist idea. The purpose of the Labour Party is to secure for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry on the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, and the best obtainable means of popular administration of each industry and service. It was a comprehensive statement. Democracy should determine how our industry develop and not leave it to the simple and crude criteria of whether you were making a profit in one year or another. It was no longer the policy of the Labour Party, so Blair decided to get rid of it. And by doing that, he stripped us of our technical claim to be a socialist party.
This is a modern party living in an age of change. It requires a modern constitution that says what we are in terms the public cannot misunderstand and the Tories cannot misrepresent.
A dramatic and unexpected climax to the speech, signalling the scrapping of the historic Clause 4, which calls for common ownership, the most dramatic indication of what Mr. Blair means by the New Labour.
Blair, from the very beginning, was reassuring his critics, including Murdoch. Don't worry, when we get there, we won't be a socialist party, we'll be a centre party, and we'll do it better than Thatcher. So in the end, the election was won, I won't say on a fraud, but won on a misunderstanding of what we were really about.
I think we all realise now that the weight of history is upon our shoulders. There's very great excitement and there's great hope in Britain today, and we celebrate that. Even greater, therefore, is our sense of humility and responsibility in not disappointing those hopes or dashing those expectations.
Whatever the risks we face today, they are as nothing compared to the risks if we do not halt Saddam Hussein's program of developing chemical and biological weapons of mass destruction.
Does Iraq possess weapons of mass destruction?
There is only one truth, and therefore I tell you, as I have said on many occasions before, that Iraq has no weapons of mass destruction whatsoever.
700 inspections at 500 different sites.
And in no case did we find any weapons of mass destruction.
If action is taken by Britain and America, it will be illegal in international law, will undermine the authority of the United Nations, and the moral responsibility for the deaths of civilians that may follow would rest with those who took that decision. The war cost hundreds of thousands of lives and didn't solve the problem, and we're still there, and it was an imperial war. I think that the decision taken to tell the British Parliament that we had to go to war with Iraq was based on false information and led to war and bloodshed and death. And therefore anyone who did that has a responsibility for it. And I think till the day he dies, he will live with that knowledge.
Oh yeah, look at that, right through the windshield.
My north, my south, my east and west, my working week and my Sunday rest, my noon, my midnight, my talk, my song. I thought that love would last forever. I was wrong. The stars are not wanted now. Put out everyone. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood. For nothing now can ever come to any good. Well, she was very ill. She had cancer, and for about 4 years she got progressively worse. And then we took her to hospital. She was very ill, and somebody came and took her away in an ambulance, and I went with her to the hospital. And then the night she died, I was with her and my 4 children were there, and the Macmillan nurse said to me, "If you like, you can say to her, you can go now if you want to, we're all here." So I said, "Well, if you want to go now, you can, we're all here." And a few moments later, she stopped breathing. And it was a dramatic moment. And my first thought was, at any rate, she suffers no more. And she's been the most powerful influence in my life without any doubt at all. May I thank the Prime Minister for all the very hard work he's done over the last 4 years, and the Leader of the Opposition for the help he has given. May I also express the hope that on June the 7th, people realise that many thousands of people sacrificed their lives to give us the vote, and if they do not use it, they betray that inheritance. It was the right thing to do, to leave Parliament when I did. And my wife suggested it to me. She said, "Why don't you leave Parliament and say you're leaving to devote more time to politics?" And I said that, and that's what I've done. And I have been very, very busy since I left the House of Commons. I conclude that from the beginning of time, there have always been 2 flames burning in the human heart. The flame of anger against injustice and the flame of hope you can build a better world. And my job is to go around fanning both flames. What we're doing today on behalf of millions and millions of people, we're making a demand. Withdraw our troops from Afghanistan and end the Afghan war. That is what we are demanding. I was in London the other day in my car, and it was clear there was going to be an accident. So I had the brilliant idea. I got out of the car, I lifted the hood, unzipped my trousers, leaned over, and I think the Bank of England call it quantitative easement. And a man came up to me and he said, "Sir," and I said, "What is it?" He said, "I think I know your problem." So I said, "What's that?" He said, "I think your radiator's leaking." So I said, "Thank you very much, I'll go straight to the garage," closed the hood, zipped up my flies and went off. I should warn you that this is a very, very subversive evening, because what we're about is the struggle of people. Every generation, the same struggle goes on for all the things that people want, freedom and justice and so on. The great lesson of socialism said it's not about conflict between men and women or black and white or Muslim and Christian. It was the conflict between the majority of the population of the world who create the world's wealth and the minority who own and control the world's wealth. There are only two sources of wealth in the world: people and land. The ownership of land is the core to everything. The land and the coal under the ground and the oil under the ground is the source of wealth. And that idea of the common ownership of land is a very, very basic one, and now it's extended to all the resources that come from the land. And that private ownership system has impoverished a lot of people and enriched a lot of others, and is that democratically acceptable? It's all about power and where it is. Too much power is in the hands of too few people. It's not the trade unions running the world, quite the opposite. It's these secret, powerful people who've got positions in industry and in society. And unless that power is exposed, it'll continue to exercise undue influence and maintain the underclass and the injustices that we see.
You are an old man who thinks in terms of nations and peoples. There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no West. There is only one holistic system of systems. One vast and immane, interwoven, interacting, multivariate, multinational dominion of dollars. Petrodollars, electrodollars, multi-dollars, Reichmarks, Rins, rubles, pounds, and shekels. It is the international system of currency which determines the totality of life on this planet. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today.
When they say the answer is austerity, that they're saying the poor have got to be asked to pay for a crisis created by the rich who gambled with their money and went bust and had to be subsidized by the government. Then they bought the banks that went bankrupt. And then they say to poor people, you've got to suffer in order to restore the economy to balance, and that is quite wrong.
Alienation is the precise and correctly applied word for describing the major social problem in Britain today. Is the cry of men and women who feel themselves the victims of blind economic forces beyond their control. It is the feeling of despair and hopelessness that pervades people who feel that they have no real say in shaping or determining their own destinies.
You, Moss, you're such a hero. You're so rich. How come you're coming down here and wasting your time with such a bunch of bums? You see this watch? You see this watch? Yeah. That watch costs more than your car. I made $970,000 last year. How much you make? You see, pal, that's who I am, and you're nothing.
It is easy and tempting, though, to hate such people. However, it's wrong. What doth it profit a man if he gain the whole world and suffer the loss of his soul?
Keir Hardie said at the beginning of the last century, he said, we've won political democracy, now economic democracy is what matters. And that makes an awful lot of sense to me, because people are still subject really to market forces, and market forces have no human element, because market forces are controlled by people who are not accountable to those they control. And that, I think, is the next stage forward. The most powerful instrument against political change is spreading cynicism. They say, oh, well, they're all the same, they're all corrupt, you'll never win. And pessimism can demoralize people engaged in a battle. So you have to believe that you can win. And history is made by people who do things.
Say we can, so we know we shan't, well, of course we shall, 'cause I've seen, I believe, that we are forever something which is incomplete. We trade ourselves for nothings in the words of our conceits. I have seen, now I believe. Ceaseless, seamless strain of your hearts one day cause yourself to make a start with me. We believe.
Things are moving much more quickly than in the past, and I think the information that's available through the internet and the mobile telephone and so on is creating a speed of change which will take us all by surprise. If you encourage people, you'll do more good than any other way, because you'll release in them the life force that makes them want to do things. When I see all these other people doing things, I am inspired by it. So I think the least I can do is to shine some of that encouragement back to them. And if on my gravestone when I died they had just the simple word, Tony Benn, he encouraged us, I would regard that as a sufficient justification for what I've done.
He always said that on his epitaph he wanted the phrase, he encouraged us. Well, Dad, you did encourage us, and you did inspire us, and your encouragement and inspiration, both for us and for others, will never end.
But I think that hope is the fuel of progress. If people don't feel that what they do will make a difference, they won't make the effort.
Because I still believe what I believed then, that the alternative is socialism or barbarism. And I tell you which side I'm on. Thank you very much, comrades.
If we don't have a dream, what do we live for? If we don't have our dreams, what did James Connolly die for? Look up, the sky is burning with blood the workers shed. We'll carry on the battle for roses and bread. Bread and roses, roses and bread. We'll carry on the battle for roses and bread. That's your bit. Bread and roses, roses and bread. We'll carry on the battle for roses and bread. Everyone, come on. Bread and roses, roses and bread. We'll carry on the battle for roses and bread. He was born to organize. That's what Jack Jones lived for being a union man. That's what Joe Hill was killed for. Let's dream that dream of dreams, a life without sorrow, and maybe our dreams will build a new tomorrow. We'll look up, the sky is burning with blood the workers shed. We'll carry on the battle for roses and bread. Louder. Bread and roses, yeah. Roses. Whoa. We'll carry for roses and bread again. Bread and roses, roses and bread. We'll carry on the battle